It's just a number, an integer between 12 and 14. Yet, how does a single number like 13 become so freighted with fear, ritual, and rule that it alters our physical world? Entire floors vanish from skyscrapers, hotel rooms are renumbered, and airlines often skip the 13th row. Some people will even change flights or postpone major life decisions to avoid it. Our modern culture acts as a powerful amplifier for this ancient anxiety. From horror films that turn Friday the 13th into a spectacle of dread, to headlines that link any misfortune to the number, we are constantly fed a narrative that treats 13 as inherently dangerous, reinforcing the superstition. But what are the true origins of this widespread phobia? Is it rooted in ancient religious texts and historical tragedies that cast a long shadow? Or is it a quirk of human psychology, a product of our brain's need to find patterns where none exist? Today, we'll trace the story of 13 across centuries and cultures, from Norse mythology to the Last Supper. We will separate documented historical roots from popular rumors and explore the psychological mechanisms that explain why this fear not only persists, but keeps reproducing itself in our modern world. Let's start with the modern diagnosis, triskaidekaphobia. It's the clinical name for an intense, irrational fear of the number 13. The term itself is a 20th century invention, but the anxiety it describes is ancient. The existence of a clinical label shows this is more than a mild superstition. For some, it's a genuine phobia causing real distress. To understand its endurance, we'll explore 4 overlapping causes: powerful narratives from mythology and religion, historical episodes that stuck in collective memory, cultural transmission through ritual, and finally, the fundamental workings of the human brain. One set of historical and mythic hooks is familiar. In Norse mythology, a banquet of 12 gods was disrupted when Loki, the 13th guest, arrived and engineered a death that brought sorrow and imbalance. On another front, in Christian contexts, the Last Supper scene is often cited. 13 people sat at the table the night before the crucifixion, 12 apostles and Jesus, with Judas counted as the 13th in many retellings. These narratives are compelling and visually memorable, which helps them spread, but they are not the whole story. Similar stories about more than the perfect dozen can be found in other cultures too, and the interpretation of those stories has changed over time. Another important thread is historical episodes that became memorable anchors. The most famous modern myth ties Friday the 13th to a single dramatic event, the arrest of the Knights Templar. On Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France, who was deeply in debt to the order, launched a coordinated dawn raid, arresting hundreds of this powerful and wealthy group of warrior monks. They were brutally tortured into confessing heresy, and the story of their sudden violent downfall has all the ingredients of a powerful legend. But here's the catch. While the arrests were real and brutal, modern historians find almost no evidence connecting this event to a widespread superstition in the centuries that followed. The link appears to be a much more recent invention, popularized in 20th century fiction and conspiracy theories. It's a classic case of retroactive mythologizing, where a compelling story is grafted onto an existing fear to give it a historical backbone it never actually had. Once a powerful narrative like the Templars is attached to the date, it acts like a cultural magnet. The date itself becomes a hook for storytelling. Any subsequent misfortune that happens to fall on a Friday the 13th is no longer just a random event. It's seen as another piece of evidence in the ongoing saga of this unlucky day, creating a self-reinforcing loop of belief. This pattern isn't unique. Consider the near-disastrous Apollo 13 mission, which launched at 1313 military time and suffered its critical explosion on April 13th. This is where our psychology plays a key role. Our brains are wired for storytelling, not statistics. We actively seek out information that confirms our beliefs, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. We latch on to the dramatic story of Apollo 13, while ignoring the thousands of flights and events involving the number 13 that pass without incident. We favor the causal-sounding link and retell the story, strengthening the myth with each telling. But cultural variation is crucial to notice. 13 is feared in many Western contexts, yet in other societies it can be neutral or even lucky. Among the Maya, for example, 13 had positive associations with the sacred. Some calendars and cosmologies use 13 as part of a full and meaningful cycle. In parts of Italy, the number 13 can be lucky, as opposed to 17, which is the unlucky one there. This variety tells us that the meaning of a number is largely cultural, not intrinsic. So why does the taboo keep reproducing in some cultures? Psychology offers the next piece. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We notice coincidences, but we also remember them more than non-events. Imagine a hotel that has 13 floors 1 year without incident, then the year after an unusual accident occurs on the 13th floor. That coincidence is vivid and memorable. Managers respond by renaming floors and guests notice the pattern. Confirmation bias then kicks in. We remember the times 13 is bad and forget the countless uneventful 13s. Social proof, seeing other people avoid 13, amplifies the effect and turns a cognitive bias into a social norm. There's also a practical economic angle. When enough people fear a number, institutions adapt. Developers skip the 13th floor because buyers prefer floors that feel safer or resale value can dip. Airlines or theaters may omit row 13. These actions both respond to and reinforce the superstition. Once a number has been institutionalized as taboo, it becomes self-fulfilling. By being absent, it looks dangerous or special, which keeps the taboo alive. Religious and ritual reinforcement adds another vector. Lucky or unlucky numbers can be embedded in rites, calendars, and folk practices. Rituals that respond to misfortune, counting talismans, avoiding certain days, help create the narrative that certain numbers have power. Over generations, these practices solidify, and the explanation can become circular. We avoid it because it's unlucky, becomes both cause and evidence. Let's test this with concrete cultural examples. The most famous in the Western world is Friday the 13th, a potent cocktail mixing a day and a number. Friday carries its own historical weight in Christian tradition as the day of the crucifixion. When this already loaded day is coupled with the infamous number 13, it transforms into a culturally sticky and deeply resonant symbol of bad luck, a perfect storm of negative associations. This specific fear wasn't always so widespread. Its popularization was boosted in the early 20th century by Thomas W. Lawson's best-selling novel. The story, about a villain engineering a Wall Street panic on that date, cemented the day's association with financial ruin in the public consciousness, helping the superstition take firm root in English-speaking cultures. The superstition became so ingrained that it began to physically alter our environment. In the United States and parts of Europe, omitting the 13th floor from buildings or the 13th row from airplanes became a visible sign of the taboo. This wasn't just superstition, it was a pragmatic business decision to appease public anxiety, showing the taboo had moved from folklore into the commercial world. Conversely, this fear of 13 is far from universal. In many East Asian cultures, the number to avoid is 4, as its pronunciation in languages like Mandarin sounds nearly identical to the word for death. In Japan, 9 is shunned as it sounds like suffering. This proves the emotional energy isn't inherent to 13 itself. It attaches to whichever numerals a culture has, for its own unique historical or linguistic reasons, ritualized as taboo. Next, let's be careful with extraordinary claims. Some modern conspiracy or sensational accounts suggest an ancient cabal or cosmic law makes 13 dangerous. There's no credible evidence for a metaphysical rule that imposes misfortune because of a numeral. Where we see repeated stories about unusual mishaps in 13, the scientific and historical explanations, selection bias, narrative construction, social transmission, provide much stronger accounts. We can also look at how humans adapt ritualistically. Some subcultures invert taboo as identity. A group might embrace the 13 label as rebellious, or markets create goods that riff on the taboo: shirts, tattoos, marketing stunts. Numbers are malleable cultural symbols. They can be feared, reclaimed, marketed, or ignored. What about measurable consequences? Economists and sociologists have tested whether market behavior changes around numerical superstitions. Small, localized impacts exist. Property developers adjust floor numbering. Some companies avoid product names with certain digits in specific markets, and occasionally ticketing or seat assignments shift to avoid customer complaints. On a larger statistical level, the evidence for systematic global harm because of the number 13 is weak. You can't easily show that 13 is causally linked to larger rates of accidents or misfortune once you control for reporting and selection biases. So what's the practical takeaway? First, numbers are cultural. Their meanings are created by stories, rituals, and institutions, not by the numerals themselves. Second, human cognition, pattern detection, memory, confirmation bias, offers a robust explanation for how certain numbers acquire charged meanings. Third, once a taboo is institutionalized, it can cause material change. building plans, airlines, and markets adapt, which in turn reinforces the taboo. Before we wrap up, a short thought on critical literacy. When modern media highlight a tragedy linked to 13, ask, how was the story selected? What alternative explanations exist? And is this one of many uneventful cases that we're ignoring? That skeptical posture helps avoid recreating folklore as fact. In closing, the mystery of 13 is not magical, it's a mirror. It shows how stories, memory, culture, and economics layer on top of cognitive instincts. Some cultures fear the number, others celebrate it. Understanding why the taboo exists makes us less at its mercy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into numbers, myths, and minds, subscribe for more episodes that separate cultural story from scientific reason. Thanks for watching.